Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Slingin Leather, Southern California's official combat sports show, and I am your host, Scuba Steve. Thank you all for tuning in. Today's episode is all about violence in sports. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Violence, whether we like to admit it or not, is an undisputable facet of all sporting competitions. Even sports with little to no physical contact, it's still present in many ways that may not always extend to the physical. The general focus of this show will be to analyze the presence of violence outside the parameters of the rules of the three types of sports which I will outline. And it will also discuss actions within rules that can motivate athletes to engage in violent actions outside of the actual competition. And additionally, what can we do as not only journalists, but as coaches and as those that are involved in sports in general? How can we prevent these actions from happening in the first place? Although there may not be one conclusive answer, it is still a question worth answering due to the fact that violence is an issue that many people lack the knowledge to the gravity of which it occurs. Now, what type of sports will be covered in this podcast? Well, I'll tell you. Non-contact sports, for one, such as volleyball, tennis, swimming, track and field, ice skating, etc., will be the first topic and the first type of sport that we will discuss. Contact sports such as football, basketball, hockey, baseball, soccer will also be discussed, as well as, of course, because this is Slingin Leather after all, combat sports. Boxing, MMA, collegiate wrestling, and grappling competitions such as judo, jiu-jitsu, and any other one you can think of will also be within the parameters of the topic of this podcast. Now, the reason that this topic is so worth getting into is because although some of the previously mentioned sports have violence ingrained within the rules, there is no justification for violence outside of a competitive context. Finding the root of these causes and educating people on why it is important to try and prevent them will create a safer environment for those involved in general. Now, there are 4 levels of violence, as well as another facet that I constitute as violence, and everyone at this point in world history should include in the definition of violence, in my personal opinion, is derived from the Sports Conflict Institute. The four types of physical violence are laid out as so. Level 1 is body contact. Physical contact that is inherently part of sports, and this is necessary to actually play the game, such as tackling in football, checking in hockey, slide tackles in soccer, striking in boxing and MMA, and submissions in grappling competitions. And although these actions are inherently violent, they're encouraged in order to properly play certain sports. Overall, they are the lowest form of violence that we have seen and will ever see in sports, since they're ingrained within the rule set. And they're especially present in contact and combat sports such as football, hockey, wrestling, boxing, MMA, and grappling. And none of these actions are associated with malicious intent, but they're simply there in order to compete the way the sport is meant to be played. And it's meant to actually facilitate the game as it was meant to be created and as it is meant to be played. Level 2 is borderline violence. Borderline violence is physical contact within the rules of a given sport, but could potentially push the boundaries of what's acceptable. This could include throwing elbows while getting a rebound. Fights in hockey, like one-on-one fights in hockey. We'll get to full team brawls in a minute. Beanballs in baseball, which are penalized by awarding the batter a base, but do not extend to legal and personal ramifications. Holding on to submissions after one is tapped. This is something that is seen as highly controversial, but oftentimes are not directly penalized unless someone has a reputation such as Husamar Palhares. Eye pokes and groin strikes also are included in this, since they are absolutely illegal and they will be stopped. However, they are not always penalized in the sense that not every time that an eye poke or a groin strike occurs, there is a point deducted from the actual scorecard. That is seen after there are several of these occurrences happening at once. This is the most prevalent in contact sports and as well as combat sports, as I previously mentioned. And it is typically associated with animosity in some of those contexts. When it comes to groin strikes and eye pokes, sometimes those will be instances that are completely accidental, and it could cause a point deduction despite it not being completely overt. But it's not typically associated with animosity or malicious intent in that realm. The previously mentioned ones, such as throwing elbows or getting into fights in hockey, are directly associated with animosity or malicious intent. And sometimes they're used to intimidate opponents. They're meant to set a precedent that they are willing to compete and toe the line with what is and what is not acceptable, and even risk getting ejected or disqualified from the context as a whole. Level 3 violence is called quasi-criminal violence, and this is violence that directly violates the rules of a sport as well as potentially legal ramifications as well. They violate actual laws that are put in place by the US government, or any government for that matter. This can include sucker punches, late hits, flagrant fouls, and things that are inherently associated with violent actions but may not constitute legal ramifications based on how severe they actually are. These often result in fouls, fines, and even potential legal ramifications if it is viewed as severe as the victim sees it. And it would obviously have to be reaffirmed by whatever governing body it would be tried under. It can absolutely cause serious injury, and it goes against the principles of sportsmanship, fair play, and respect, and it directly stems from animosity. You don't see athletes that respect each other going and sucker punching one another, because it is simply out of the question that you would do this to anyone that you don't have animosity towards, or some level of animosity towards. Level 4, and the most severe physical violence level, is criminal violence. Violence that not only violates the rules of a sport, but it also violates laws. This is the absolute most severe, and it's not even close. This could go as far as to assaulting spectators, assaulting coaches, premeditated attacks, or using equipment as a weapon. And these could, or if not, definitely will result in fines, arrest, and potentially jail time. This is viewed as completely unacceptable by athletes and coaches alike, no matter who you ask. It does not matter. And thankfully, it is the fewest number of examples that we will explore today. Often stated by athletes, this is often executed by athletes with a violent reputation, and it does not justify or it does not give reason as to why they occur, but it does give context as to the motivation of people to go far beyond the levels and rules of a sport to go and inflict violence against their opponent. Now, one that I chose to separate from this list, but chose to highlight specifically, is due to the climate that we live in today. And this specifically is trash talk. Trash talk, as you guys know, is rhetoric that is meant to upset an athlete by insulting various aspects of their personality, their team, their family, their significant other, their play style, or anything associated with their life or actions that is then used to launch verbal attacks towards that other person. In a study done by Kevin Niffen and Daniel Palacio, men are far more prone to trash talk than women. And this is reflected in many of the major sports cultures, as you rarely see women engaging in super malicious trash talk, and it is evident that it is far more associated with male athletes as well. They also elaborate on the proximity of the topic, which determines how malicious the attack will come off. If you're attacking someone for something vain about themselves, like, oh, I don't like your haircut, it's not going to be viewed quite as maliciously as someone attacking one's family, similar to how Colby Covington did to Leon Edwards in the build-up to their fight, which prompted a bit of a scuffle. I'm not going to say it was a full-fledged brawl, but there was intervening that needed to occur, but to ensure that they did not actually come to blows. Although it is statistically more common for trash talk to occur in contact sports, combat sports have trash talk far more often, despite the number of people that actually participate in those sports. I'd say the tendency and the actual instances of trash talk are outweighed by contact sports sheerly due to the number of people that are actually involved in contact sports relative to combat sports. But it is such an inseparable fact and facet of combat sports that is used to sell the product that is being put forth. You obviously see combat sports athletes that have the utmost respect, that have nothing bad to say about their opposition. But on the other side of the coin, there are certain fighters and there are certain competitors that will go that extra mile to attempt to upset their opponents and sell the conflict that is at hand by using trash talk. And this is evident not only in social media, but in the press conferences that they also hold. Excuse me. Olufemi Nathan Osoko, also known as the Voyze on Twitter, shoot him a follow, is a multi-sports journalist that covers combat and contact sports. Here is what he sees violence in sports as.
That's a great question. When you brought this to me, my initial thought was physical violence. So, it could be something seemingly as minor as a basketball player who is always, throwing elbows and, taking cheap shots and things of that nature, to a full out brawl. But the verbal definitely can play into things. As a matter of fact, that piece is often weaponized in sports. It's the psychological aspect of things and needling at and using your words to get in the head of someone else is another form of violence that is not only readily accepted within the sporting community, but it's championed. That's something that's looked upon favorably, and that's not something I've really thought of before.
However, some may not feel the same way about constitutes as violence in sports. James Stowell III is the program director for Radio DePaul Sports and covers non-contact and combat sports. He feels that violence constitutes something different.
Violence in sports to me is something like the Malice at the Palace brawl, where players jump into the stands and fight with fans, or fans getting onto the court and just randomly attacking people. It's not as common as some people think. They're like, in Europe, there are a lot of these fans called ultras, and they're the people who make all the pyrotechnics, all the flares, the smoke, all that crazy shit you see over there. They're not really the violent type, mind you. They're just the loud type. The only violent ones they're called hooligans, which is like a subset from those ultras, and those are rarely ever seen because whenever fighting, like violence in sports, it's rare, but it's also sent mainstream all over the place. The second something violent happens, it's sent all over mainstream media, and then they try to attach this as violent.
Mm-hmm. And so you wouldn't necessarily extend that to something like trash talk or like insulting someone's family or anything like that. Would you consider that violence as well, or would you consider that something else entirely?
I would just consider that an attack of character or defamation, which in and of itself isn't really violent. To me, violent is like strictly physical. At that point, it's just like defamation of character, depending on what setting it is. If you wrote your trash talk, then at that point it could be libel. Like if you trash talk and say something that's completely wrong, at that point, that's libel.
Depending on who you ask, what constitutes as violence in sports varies, but an indisputable fact of trash talk that can be is that it can be a catalyst for violence. That it is often the straw that breaks the camel's back for violence to start growing or animosity to start growing. And since this is so much more prevalent these days with the presence of social media, it is without a doubt, in my opinion, that it must be at least considered, if not confirmed, to be a facet of violence that we must absolutely consider. Now we'll be getting into the instances of violence in the specific types of sports. In non-contact sports, the types of violence that are obviously most prevalent are trash talk, instances of quasi-criminal violence. there's not a whole lot of borderline violence other than the occasional pushing and shoving, which cannot be considered quasi-criminal violence, but it is certainly within the realm of violence as well. There are also instances of criminal violence as well, as I will get into. Instances such as Mute versus Andreev in tennis, where they started to draw at the net, and they eventually incited that they wanted to take it into the hallway in which they walk out and start a fight, is a prime example of trash talk, which could have resulted in quasi-criminal violence. Indisputable instance of quasi-criminal violence is when two Nepalese volleyball players were being berated by a spectator and was receiving racist comments from that specific spectator, and then they went and assaulted him. This only ended up being a suspension for the players, and it did not actually result in any legal action being taken because of the nature of what that fan was actually saying. But the biggest and most severe instance of violence in non-contact sports that I can find involved the Nancy Kerrigan incident. Now, Nancy Kerrigan was an Olympic level ice skater, figure skater, in the 1990s, and she was targeted by an attack by one of her biggest rivals and one of her most bitter rivals, Tonya Harding, whom also competes for the United States and also competes in the Olympics. And she was, Harding, orchestrated an attack on Nancy Kerrigan that left her injured and left her unable to compete. She hired someone to actually go and hit Kerrigan in the leg with a baton that injured her severely and left her unable to compete, which led to Tonya Harding winning that national championship that year in 1994. And a lot of these instances were motivated through trash talk, and were with the Kerrigan incident specifically being interpersonal rivalries, being the innate animosity of one competitor to another simply due to their actual ability. And this actually is the most severe, and far and away the most severe, because there is not a comparable instance in any type of non-contact sport that I could find. There is also instances of racism from spectators, which motivated the Nepalese volleyball players to lash out the way they did. And the biggest facet of these sports that lead to violence is the fact that there are isolated individuals that are subject to ridicule from a specific competitor or spectator, which then escalates further based on how offensive the attack actually is. In contact sports, the biggest types of violence that are most prevalent are body contact, quasi-criminal violence, and criminal violence. And some of these instances include the Malice in the Palace, one of the worst and most severe instances of criminal violence in sports in general, but in contact sports as well. This is when Ron Artest went and assaulted several spectators in the crowd, and it was regarded as one of the most malicious attacks in NBA history. Also, the 2003 ALCS with the New York Yankees playing the Boston Red Sox, where Pedro Martinez threw one of the Yankees coaches to the ground and nearly hurt him. He was a very old man, and he chose to inflict violence on someone who was unable to defend himself. Just this past year, Jose Ramirez versus Tim Anderson in the MLB. When Jose Ramirez slid into second base after hitting a double, Tim Anderson stood over him and started to talk and started to insult him and started to ask him questions as to why. And Ramirez fired right back, asking why he's still standing above him, which led to blows. It led to a full-on fight, and Tim Anderson being knocked out by from a right hook by Jose Ramirez. And this includes to full team brawls in hockey. There are so many examples of this in contact sports that it can be. This is far from an exhaustive list, but these are the biggest instances of criminal, quasi-criminal, and borderline violence, in the sense that of Ramirez versus Anderson, where there was completely legal contact with Jose sliding into second base. He didn't even contact Tim Anderson. He just simply was sitting underneath him, laying on the ground, and then they started to draw, which then escalated to a full-on brawl. And many of these were caused by trash talking in general, and this is going to be a theme, as you guys will come to realize in this podcast. They are, as well as fan trash talk, which motivated the Malice in the Palace incident, which made it escalate far more than it initially probably would have. And addition, pre-existing rivalries in the context of the New York Yankees and the Boston Red Sox. They've been bitter rivals for their entire history. Ever since the Curse of the Bambino, they have not liked each other, and it came to a head in 2003. We don't see this as much today within inter-team rivalries, but this is one of the biggest instances of where tensions boiled over so much that it left someone injured and it left a geriatric being thrown to the ground. And this violence and the violence that is within these sports that's ingrained within the rules can also be a huge motivator as to why these instances popped off in the first place. And the innate physical contact, again, is the biggest catalyst for this. In addition to the trash talk, I think that's a double-edged sword there, where both the contact that is being inflicted during the competition will influence what is happening outside of the competition as well as animosity between specific players. It's obvious that Jose Ramirez and Tim Anderson had some beef before, and it came to a head in that instance where they fought. In combat sports specifically, trash talk is far and away the most prevalent and most overt form of violence that occurs, as well as borderline violence and quasi-criminal violence. But in combat sports specifically, since it's used to sell more tickets, since it's used to gain more attention for a specific event, it completely has its role within the sport. And this shouldn't necessarily be the case, but it is undeniable that it is a facet of combat sports and absolutely deserves to be acknowledged. And some of the most severe instances of quasi-criminal violence in MMA and boxing history is Khabib Nurmagomedov versus the Crowd at UFC 229. After Khabib submitted Conor McGregor, he started to point into the crowd at Dylan Dennis specifically, and then chose to climb over the cage and jump into the crowd to go and confront him. There was an instance where UFC welterweights Paul Daly and Josh Koscheck fought, and out of complete frustration, Paul Daly went and sucker punched Josh Koscheck behind his back and landed a left hook after the bell had occurred. This led to Paul Daly being immediately fired from the UFC and will never compete in that promotion again. There are also instances in boxing, such as Logan Paul versus Dylan Dennis and Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz, where full-on melees have occurred after the competition is already over. And other than this, as well as Mike Tyson versus Evander Holyfield, that's another instance of absolute quasi-criminal violence that occurs because of pure frustration. And that is one of the most notorious instances in boxing history as to violence occurring within the competition. That is far beyond that is far beyond the actual scope of the rules. A lot of these were, at the end of the day, caused by the trash talk that is seen so prevalently in combat sports. Crowd intervention as well, especially within the Paul versus Dennis and Paul versus Diaz instances. There's a lot of group animosity as well. In this case, it more so extends to ethnic backgrounds as well, especially since a lot of Russian fighters stand with each other. In that melee seen at UFC 229 with Khabib Nurmagomedov, two of Khabib's teammates came into the cage afterward and assaulted Conor McGregor, or at least attempted to assault Conor McGregor. They definitely did land a punch, but this type of animosity that was built from Conor McGregor's trash talk led to a great and one of the most notorious, no pun intended, one of the most notorious instances of violence in combat sports history. And the innate violence within the rules doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of violence. At the end of the day, it gives people room to engage in more trash talk, because at the end of the day, they are going to get into a cage or a ring or a grappling mat and actually fight and actually prove or maybe not even prove, but actually release their frustrations through violence. And when they cross familial lines and boundaries involving one's ethnicity or racist comments in trash talk, it is far more likely, especially in the Habib case, where something like quasi criminal violence will occur. When it comes to most violence outside of competition, the one that is far most prevalent in is definitely combat sports. And I don't even think it is legitimately close. I had to really sit there and think for combat sports what types of innate violence has occurred outside of competition. And the examples mentioned above do not even begin to scratch the surface as just to how many instances of violence there are in combat sports. Football in particular seems to have the highest level of violent outbursts due to the violence that is inherently ingrained within the sport, as well as the brutality of the contact occurring. Zain Bando is a multi-sports journalist that covers combat and contact sports, and he believes that football is most prone to violence outside of competition.
Oh, I'd say football. Especially if you consider offensive lineman drills, you banging your head against a platform, when you do the sled exercise, if you're a center, whether that's you know playing in a 7-on-7 practice with those many jersey pennies, and the quarterback accidentally gets knocked to the ground and gets injured. Yeah, I think football, to me, and I don't know the exact stats to prove this, but based on what I've seen and based on what I've read, I think football is more than likely the most dangerous major sport that currently takes place in this country. But the thing with me is I don't watch football for the violence. I don't watch combat sports for the violent aspect of it. I will watch it because I think it's an artistry. I think it's beautiful to see, an amazing quarterback institute a 2-minute drill. I think it's great when you see the greatest fighter in the world that's defended his or her title 8 times and is going to break a record. Like, I think that stuff is cool. There's every so often where it would be like, well, it would be great for the storyline if so and so knocks this person out. But at the end of the day, I think it's the stories and the chapters of a certain fight or a certain game that makes that sport or that event enticing, and not exactly the physical act of it. And that's what I try to tell people when people say, "Oh, Zan, you like that stuff where people just beat the crap out of each other?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, they beat the crap out of each other, but if you look at some of the situations that these women or men are in, they wouldn't be doing anything else, because that's how they were brought up, and that was the only way that they felt that they could survive instead of going out to get a real job." And I think that's something that people who don't understand the sport or don't follow the sport fail to realize.
Social media in general has played an undoubted role in facilitating animosity since its creation, and the differences have been more than evident. In the realm of contact and combat sports, it has been most evident without a doubt. You don't see it as much in non contact sports. Many rivalries in combat sports are innately fueled by the trash talk that is said on social media or said on a press conference stage as well. But in the lead up to the fight, the longevity is far more prolonged because they're able to contact each other through the internet. An example of this is Jones versus Daniel Cormier in mixed martial arts, or Ryan Garcia and Devin Haney in boxing. And although it is generally more accepted in combat sports due to the fact that they will fight at the end of the day and it is meant to sell more tickets and make more money for both combatants, it is still evident that it creates so much more animosity within certain fighters. Nathan discussed about how social media is being a catalyst for violence and how it is honestly reaffirmed in several mediums such as music.
Social media often magnifies the things that are already in people. And I believe it has helped with creating an environment where people are more comfortable with sharing ideas and thoughts that would have been fringe a few years ago, but now are being more readily accepted because there's an environment where you can say and do these things. And not just an environment where you can say and do these things, you can do it with little to no punitive action against yourself. That's really where things are dangerous and get dangerous. Not saying that there aren't consequences to these things. Again, speaking of violence and social media, one of the direct correlations that you can look at is the drill music culture in Chicago. A number of these young people, their songs, is going out, and people within different camps are finding them out and doing, different things. So it's not that it cannot come back to you, um, but it's a rarity that it happens when, depending on who you're going after. If it's someone in your neighborhood and in your community, yes, you're much more likely to reap the you reap the negative benefits of saying the things that you say. When there is that distance, that's where normally things are allowed to just go on.
In contact sports, allegiances to specific teams and players lead to trash talk. But this is still informative for those in sports journalism in the sports journalism industry at the end of the day. Zain actually believes that social media is a double-edged sword where it is both beneficial for the journalists as well as detrimental for those that do get involved that are not necessarily in the industry.
I do, but if you notice some of these team accounts, they've really scaled back on saying anything negative towards the rival because there's some sort of an integrity aspect to that. But in terms of what fans do, absolutely. I mean, fans literally make accounts that are based solely on their team and their team only. And if you try to come after them and say, oh, hey, team X sucks, and they take offense to it and they start saying nasty things to the other person, as much as it may be ugly and as much as it may be like this person has nothing else to do, they have no time on their hands, it is kind of what the culture has turned into. And I think now rivalries have gotten even bigger because of the whole social media aspect. And especially if you're in those circles on those various platforms, where you read the beat reporters and you read the fans' opinions based on X team or Y team, then yeah, you're definitely gonna have a difference of opinion based on whose side you're on. And if you're not on a side and you're a genuine national reporter, it's gonna be about, how are you gonna cover this from a lens to where you are getting both sides and you are telling the complete story. So
No, I mean, that's I feel like that's going to be a focus in this project about how it's just becoming a lot more commodified with social media and everything. So I mean, no, that's something I completely agree with, especially with the fact that we have like Blue Demon Degenerate on Twitter for DePaul that just sort of at this point they're hating on themselves because DePaul basketball is in a hole right now, but that's neither here nor there. Um, I was curious. I've noticed that in the grand scheme of contact sports versus combat sports, that there are more instances of violence in contact sports like basketball or football or things of that nature, even hockey, for example. Um, do you think that if there is more innate violence in the sport being played or among certain players of a sport, do you think if there is a greater presence of violence in their sport, that there's a less, or is that a reason for there being fewer violent actions?
can you rephrase the question in a
Sorry, my
different
bad.
way? Yeah,
My bad.
I sort of I sort of lost you near the end.
So do you think that if there's more innate violence in a given sport, like football, where there's violence that
Okay.
is acted out in every single play, do you think the more potential violence that could be caused in the realm of competition is the reason that sometimes that there's a reduction in violent outbursts outside of competition for that. Because I mean, there aren't a whole lot of instances, for example, in MMA where people are attacking each other outside of the octagon or after competition. There are certainly instances, but I mean, versus
Right.
like the Malice in the Palace, for example, like in basketball, there have been a lot of violent outbursts. I was wondering if do you think that the presence of violence could be a reason that there are fewer instances of this?
Yeah, because I think all the violence is being taken out on the field and not afterward.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I think they understand that once the clock hits zero, they have to go back to being professionals and saying that that was one game and they need to move on to the next one. And I think in terms of in terms of the in terms of the combat sports realm, I think after the Khabib McGregor incident 5 years ago, I think, and I don't know this for certain, but I'm almost positive that NSAC, which is the Nevada State Athletic Commission, and the UFC looked very closely at that, and he said this promotion just got way too dark. We should have never let this happen. And if you've noticed, outside of very few other instances, it's never happened again. So, I think they understand that for them to be on, the level of the four major sports or anything, they have to look and act professional, even though this is sort of a completely separate topic, even though there are other instances of the sport that don't put them on par with the other four majors. But I do think in terms of the four majors, I think they understand if it is a violent contact sport, that's going to be done during 60 minutes. And once 60 minutes is over, that's it. And they have to move on to the next one. And then kind of the cycle continues. But I think it only gets worse. It only gets worse if the referees get involved. And it only gets worse if there's tons of personal foul penalties and there's players pushing each other and whatnot. And then it spills over after the game on social media. That's when it gets worse.
It is evident that social media has helped create a barrier of anonymity that allows fans and players alike to feel as if they are allowed to say whatever disrespectful anecdote is on their mind. And there's a sports culture, however, that seems to have used violence to create more respect among athletes, this being Japanese baseball. In Japanese youth baseball specifically, and in Japanese sports in general, you can see this very often. They value respect for one's opponent over anything. Before and after every baseball game, teams bow to each other to show their appreciation for the opportunity to compete against their competitors. And despite the immense amount of respect that is held between competitors, there is a stunning presence of violence between coaches and players, especially in youth competitions in youth baseball. It is well documented, and was never treated as a big deal until recently, since they've finally started to actually start cracking down on it. There are full videos of players being assaulted by coaches and even full-on beatings taking place, which are started by coaches and fueled by the fact that that their players have somehow disrespected them or disrespected the actual method in which they train. And it's really interesting to determine, is this violence or is this discipline? I asked James about this topic, and here is what he had to say.
I think it's probably a whole different sense of like a whole different cultural idea of respect, mind you, because in Japan, I feel like their culture, like I don't usually think of Japanese like insulting other people, mind you.
No.
When you think of like a Japanese, this is probably stereotypical. Like you think of like person who tries
I
to
was
treat
just
as
having
many
this discussion yesterday, and this came up. It is not. Don't think
yeah,
about
like
it.
it's like Japanese people try to treat everyone with as much dignity and respect as possible, whereas some Americans they kind of disrespect people that disagree with them on like something as little as like what they like or like who they identify as, stuff like that. And I feel like just the whole sense of like respect is a lot different. And where Japan, like, yes, granted, I don't think hitting kids with kendo sticks is a good idea, mind you. But then I also think it's how the players are raised in Japan, where they're raised to treat people with respect, and like you don't usually see homes where like kids are disrespectful to their parents or where they're disrespectful to their elders. America that has a problem where now the younger generation is getting more bolder, they're getting more disrespectful, mind you, towards like their adults or their superiors, and they kind of come off as pompous at times. Some come off as lazy, and so the player like coach, you have to get them players to buy into your system, and I guess in this case through maybe their parents. Japanese kids are buying into their coach systems, no matter how obscene it kind of looks with them getting beat with a kendo stick.
No, I mean it's intense. That's why, like, there's like locker room video of manager straight up throwing a beating on a kid for I think. Well, I mean, he started punching and kicking his whole team because they didn't leave their phones in their lockers when they were in class. That was one thing. And then there
Oh,
was
really?
another, again, this specific instance, I'm not sure what the kid could have possibly done to warrant an actual fucking beating being thrown on him. But I'm just wondering, like, if, I mean, in my, I mean, in part of this project, it was to sort of find a, it was to find, like, to find a relative solution that I could come up with. I'm quickly realizing that there's not one size fits all for any of this. But do you think that level of violence between coaches and players is justified if there is more respect being held in the competition for one's opposition?
I still don't think it's justified, but then again, I am from the US. Our norms, our values are a lot different than that of Japan. So yeah, when you say one size fits all, like that'll never work because every single country around the world has different values and norms. Ours are much more relaxed, where in some cases parents get called abusers because they like yell at a child who did something wrong. Like let's say a child broke some, and then you see a parent screaming because like you broke my vase. Some people call that abuse. I say no, that's discipline. The Japanese would
Yeah.
probably say discipline in that case. And then where Japanese, some would see their kids getting beaten up with a kendo stick as like discipline. Americans would probably see that as complete and utter fucking abuse.
Although the actions of these coaches are inherently violent, they're not seen as attacks in Japan, but a means of keeping young players the means of keeping young players and keeping them disciplined and pushing them to their absolute limit and establishing order. This made me realize that since there are so many different sports cultures around the world and what is viewed as acceptable from a hierarchical standpoint, it's really hard to lock down what specifically we can do to create a solution that will be applicable to every sport in every country in the world. What we may deem as acceptable in the United States may be seen as what we may deem as unacceptable in the United States may seem completely acceptable in different cultures. And it now begs the question, is this type of discipline justified because of the violence that it prevents, or is it still pushing the envelope too far? Speaking personally, I will say going as far to assault your players is far too much. But establishing repercussions for violent actions is more than acceptable as long as they do not harm your players. That is going far beyond what is acceptable in the United States. It may be what's acceptable in Japan, but it is certainly not as what is acceptable here. And in terms of a solution for violence in sports in general, I will now give the floor to my three guests to see what they believe the solution is to prevent violence in sports, starting with Zain.
Well, I think the social media platforms could do a better job of like putting warning signs below tweets, like saying if you tweet this, you are incentivizing X, or if you tweet this, there's a chance your account could get a strike, and if you do this again, you make it banned. So I think putting more measures in place for the average fan to make sure that he or she behave themselves is the most important thing in making sure that these instances don't happen. Because even though the players my theory has always been this: even though the players say they don't read anything, they read everything. I mean, let's be honest, most of these people are so famous that they have social media people checking everything that's out about them, making sure that they're painted in the best possible light. There's no way you can't tell me that these major multi-million dollar athletes don't see all of the major stories that are written about them, because in my opinion, they have to.
Mm-hmm.
They
I
have to.
mean, do you think that goes for athletes as well? Do you think that they should be held to the same standards as fans?
Oh yeah, 1000%, yeah. Because they're the ones that are the professionals. They're the ones making millions of dollars. They are the ones sacrificing their bodies for other people's entertainment. So yeah, they should definitely be held to the same standard. Will there be? That's an entirely different question. But should they be? Absolutely.
Possibly stipulate into their okay, so in both contact and non-contact sports, stipulate, or actually you can do this for all sports, put a stipulation into their contracts where you like if you engage in any outside brawls, whether with a player or with a civilian, you get penalized with a certain amount of money from your contract, depending on how high or low they are. Like if they're a player, like let's say on the NBA league minimum, and you're fined like $500,000 if you beat the fuck out of someone, that's a lot of money for them. Whereas if LeBron did it, that would be like pennies to him, but still, in some cases, maybe for stars, if they got involved in that, if they all got engaged in violence, then the penalties should be way higher at that point. And then for contact sports like UFC, stipulate that into the fighter into their contract for the fight. And but in that case, if you engage in violence outside of it prior to the fight, at that point, either your pay from that fight is like slashed in half, or just outright you're off the card immediately. Because if you're punching like your coworkers outside of the octagon, let alone punching a random civilian, unless it's in the act of self-defense. If all of this, like all I've said, if this is in self-defense, that's fine. But if you're the one starting it, that point is when the penalties and potential fines that come out.
No, that makes sense. So you're in favor of actually like putting it in people's contracts rather than like attempting to change the respect or level of culture around.
I
Hey,
definitely think it also has to be a respect and culture. The problem is a lot of the adult, like as the older we get, it's kind of harder for us to change how we are at times. And considering like a lot of older people are very stubborn, and it's just hard to make them change. Like I do think it should be a change of like respect and culture. The problem is it won't happen in this generation. We need to instill that in the next one. That would be more of a long-term solution. Short-term, add that stipulation into the contracts and fight cards. Like add those stipulations for short-term benefits. Long-term benefits, yeah, try to instill a better sense of culture and respect, values, norms into the next generation, because I don't Gen Z, it's going to be almost impossible for that to happen with how idiotic we are at times.
Again, much of this is due to the kind of environment that's been created. There needs to be a fostering among athletes and just among human beings as a whole to be respectful of others. Respect their feelings, respect their thoughts. Just because a thought is different doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong and you're right. And even if that is the case, at least here in the US, you have the freedom to kind of think the things that you want to think. So respect them. And the way that you learn to respect people is by spending time with them. You understand them a bit more. And just like crazy Uncle Joe, yeah, he's crazy. He has some wild ideas, but that's your Uncle Joe who you love, and you see at all the family gatherings, and you have a relationship with him, which makes ignoring, for the most part, those crazy things easier, because we don't have relationships with people anymore. We don't know our neighbors. We don't even know necessarily the people that we work with because of the cottage industry and so many remote positions. You don't know people anymore. So
you don't.
getting to know people and learning who they are and allowing them to learn about you is how you bring down much of the confusion, much of the tension that we see in our world today, not just in sports, but throughout the world.
And you correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like it comes from a place where, or a lot of the misunderstandings, a lot of the violent outbursts come from places of misunderstanding or ignorance towards the person you are upset at.
It may not even be misunderstandings. It may not even be misunderstandings. These things could be factual items, but when you know someone, when you have a relationship with someone, you're more cognizant of what you're saying and how that can impact them, how it impacts their lives, their families' lives, your life. Prime example would be the pain that Will Smith has endured for slapping Chris Rock. When he did that, he didn't think about Chris Rock's brother, Tony, who he worked with on a show that he produced, and how that damaged that relationship and damaged so many other relationships. Got caught up in the moment and did something where, when you have stronger relationships with people, you try to think about those things before you allow yourself to move in emotion. You weigh the pros and cons of what you're doing and what the outcome of the actions will be.
In conclusion, trash talk seems to be the catalyst for the vast majority of violent outbursts in sports, and it is evident and facilitated by social media. Sure, some are caused by spectators and their own trash talk, but most instances are caused by athlete on athlete trash talk and animosity. Social media is more than a huge catalyst for violence in sports, and more respect should be held between athletes while conversing online, because at the end of the day, we are not going to see, we are going to see each other, and we are going to remember what they said over social media, and this will play into how they treat you once the competition starts. Personally, I believe that most violent actions in sports would be prevented through a greater level of respect between athletes and for the sport they play. Whether this is achieved through education or through discipline, both has to be tested further in the grand scheme of professional sports and in the world. Because as soon as we start educating athletes on how severe violence can get, they will be less likely to actually engage in it. And whether this comes through simply arranging classes and arranging training where they are sat down and taught what it can lead up to, this could be great. Or it could be a level of discipline. And I'm not saying physical discipline. I'm more so saying other types of discipline that can be seen in different parts of the world, or just simply fines. That would do a large part into preventing violence at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, more people still have to be educated on how real violence can get. And this is the biggest glaring issue. I feel that those who have not been exposed to as much violence will, at the end of the day, treat it as something with far less gravity than it should. And I believe this is why, by and large, a lot of combat sports athletes are not likely to assault someone outside of competition. Sure, there are instances, but they are far less than that in contact sports, which are fueled by the innate contact that is within the sport, as well as the fact of trash talk and animosity among teams. Thank you guys so much for watching Slingin Leather, and a huge thanks to Nathan, Zain, and James for their interviews and the valuable insight that they provided. Be sure to hit the like and subscribe button below for more of Southern California's official combat sports show, and be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram, where the links will be found in the description below, and I will also include Nathan, Zain, and James's Twitter, just so you guys can give them a follow as well. Remember to protect yourself at all times, and we will see you all in the next one.